My golden brother lied to my wife, turning her against me. I exposed him, costing him his job and friends. My name is Eric, and I'm 29 years old. Up until recently, I thought I was living the life I'd always wanted. A good job where I felt respected and valued, a circle of friends I could turn to for anything, and most importantly, a wife who was my rock, my true support. Sounds pretty ideal, right? But there's always been one element of tension in my life. Jake, my older brother. Jake is 31 and has always been our parents' shining star, the golden child. Growing up, he could do no wrong, at least in their eyes. If I got a decent grade, Jake had already swept some academic award. If I managed a successful project at work, Jake was somehow conquering the world in his field. Dad would always say, "Look up to your brother. That's how success is done." Mom, on the other hand, had this habit of sighing with admiration whenever Jake was mentioned, like he was some sort of walking masterpiece. And me? I learned to accept it, almost like it was just the way of things. I didn't take it too personally. I genuinely believed in family. I figured it didn't matter if I was always coming in second place, as long as we all had each other's backs. I brushed off my frustrations and believed I was doing the right thing by staying supportive. But then, I discovered something that completely blindsided me. Turns out, Jake wasn't just content to bask in the admiration of our family. No, he'd apparently decided that his one pedestal wasn't enough. One day, by pure accident, I stumbled upon evidence that Jake had been spreading lies about me to my own wife, twisting my words and actions to create a version of me that was nothing but a fabrication. The guy I'd looked up to, the golden child, was actively working to turn my wife against me, as if my life wasn't challenging enough. It was then that I realized this wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was betrayal. Life with Sarah took an unexpected turn when she began seeing a therapist. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone needs an outlet, someone neutral to confide in. But slowly, I sensed something shift between us. She started looking at me differently. Cold, distant, like I'd somehow become the source of all her frustrations. One night, out of nowhere, she turned to me and said, "Eric, you don't always understand me," with a tone that suggested I should already know everything she needed without her saying a word. That look, though, was just the beginning. Suddenly, my every move seemed to set off a sigh, an eye roll, a subtle shake of her head. It was like I couldn't do anything right. Even entering a room felt like a disturbance to her peace. I wasn't doing anything differently. I was still me, just observing how this new, colder version of Sarah seemed to emerge. Then there was Jake. He'd always been around, but now he'd taken on a new role in my life, one I hadn't exactly invited him into. At first it was little things, a coffee here, a casual conversation there. But soon enough, he was dropping by nearly every day, sometimes even when I wasn't home. My own brother was now somehow more present in my home, with my wife, than I was. And what's more, Sarah seemed thrilled by it. "Eric, you should really listen to Jake. He just gets it," she'd say with a tone that suggested he was some sort of authority on life and relationships. But Jake's influence didn't stop with casual advice. Sarah began looking to him, almost leaning on him, as if he were the person she'd always needed but never had, right there, in my own family. The small constant nudges to work on myself became a steady drumbeat, and it was as if she were standing next to him, not me. What I'd always considered a strong, stable marriage was slowly unraveling, becoming something unrecognizable. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster, knowing each day I'd wake up and face this suspicious, unsettling new reality that was my life with Sarah and somehow Jake. One day I accidentally overheard them talking, or maybe in hindsight it wasn't all that accidental. I was in the next room, oblivious, not suspecting a thing, until I heard Jake's voice. There he was, the master of subtle manipulation, whispering to Sarah in that smooth, conspiratorial tone. It was like he'd cast himself in the role of her confidant, her guide through some imaginary maze of doubts. And the words he was saying? "Sarah, you know Eric isn't the man you married," he murmured, as if he were helping her uncover some profound truth about me. He sounded like he was playing therapist, acting as if he were revealing some long-hidden reality she had been blind to. I can barely put into words what was running through my mind at that moment. It was like I could physically feel him dripping poison into her mind, drop by drop, eroding whatever trust she still had in me. He wasn't just talking, he was reshaping her entire perspective of me. And what was his angle? In Jake's twisted version of reality, I was some sort of domineering, controlling husband, always pressuring her, always demanding too much. And Jake, with his self-appointed expert insight, was just there to show her the truth about who I really was. The impact of that one conversation was almost visceral. I felt a chill down my spine that I couldn't shake. Should I have confronted him right then and there? Sure, that's what most people might think. But in my family, a direct confrontation with Jake would only backfire. He was always our parents' golden boy, their favorite, their untouchable pride and joy. Any conflict would just paint me as the jealous, insecure younger brother, while Jake would emerge as the voice of reason. And what puzzled me the most was this sudden idea he had cooked up about me being aggressive or controlling. I couldn't fathom where he got it, let alone why he was so committed to making Sarah believe it. He acted like he knew more about how I should conduct myself in my own life than I did, as if he had the authority to dictate my role in my own marriage. But the worst part, Sarah started changing too, almost as if she'd bought into his narrative. She grew distant, closed off, and there was a tension in her eyes that I'd never seen before. It was like she was harboring some secret, one that I was somehow unworthy of knowing. Every conversation between us felt haunted, like Jake's presence lingered in the room even when he wasn't physically there. And day by day, it became alarmingly clear to me that Jake's mission to drive a wedge between us was succeeding. He wasn't just chipping away at her trust, he was on the brink of stealing it entirely. And with every passing moment, I felt our relationship slipping further and further out of my control. Weeks slipped by, and my suspicions transformed from fleeting doubts to undeniable, looming shadows, almost like trying to grab hold of a comet tearing through my life. And then came the day that changed everything. By chance, though we both know there was nothing accidental about it, I came across messages from Jake to Sarah. I stared at my phone, feeling the blood drain from my face as his words unfolded, slamming into me like blows. Jake was writing about me like I was some criminal mastermind, casting my every action in the darkest possible light. In his twisted narrative, I was setting people up at work to climb the corporate ladder, manipulating situations to ensure my own success. It wasn't enough for Jake to believe that I'd earned my place through hard work and dedication. No, to him, the only possible explanation was that I'd somehow cheated or betrayed others to get where I was. My dear brother, the man who always wore his integrity like a badge of honor, was painting me as a ruthless schemer with a team of underhanded tactics. And it didn't end there. His messages to Sarah spun an even darker story, one where I apparently had my own people in shady circles, pulling strings like I was some kind of underworld boss. He'd turned my life into the plot of a poorly written crime novel, complete with dark connections and whispered accusations of me being morally weak. Apparently, I was a danger to my family, incapable of caring for them. Really? This coming from the man who had never once taken responsibility for anyone but himself. Jake, whose entire life revolved around preserving his own inflated image, was suddenly an authority on morals and family values. As I read those messages, a heavy weight settled in my chest. The shock morphed into anger, then a feeling of utter betrayal. My own brother wasn't just dropping subtle hints anymore. He was fabricating an entire narrative to ruin me. It was as if he'd become so intoxicated by his own lies that he genuinely believed I was some villain in his little drama, someone who deserved to be stripped of everything. I realized then that this wasn't just about sibling rivalry or jealousy. Jake was deliberately tearing down everything I'd built, my career, my marriage, my reputation, and all while pretending he was doing Sarah a favor, revealing my true colors as if he were her savior. And what was I supposed to do now? Just sit there and let him dismantle my life piece by piece? Swallow it and hope things would magically resolve themselves? No. That day, something shifted inside me. I saw Jake's concern for what it really was, a carefully orchestrated plan to steal away everything I held dear. And I knew then that I wasn't going to just stand by and let him take it. Instead of storming in with accusations or creating some dramatic showdown, I decided to approach Jake on my own terms, with a strategy that would beat him at his own game. If he was going to play the puppet master, then fine. I'd play along, but this time I'd be the one directing the script. He'd get to stay in the spotlight he loved so much, but I was about to pull the strings. The first step was simple: gather evidence. And honestly, it turned out to be far easier than I'd anticipated. I took screenshots of his messages to Sarah, every vile word about my supposed moral weakness, and his absurd theories on how I was some unhinged control freak. Jake must have forgotten that in the digital age, his private lies could be saved, preserved, and eventually used against him. In his arrogance, he didn't consider how easily his so-called truths could be dismantled with a few well-placed screenshots. But I wasn't going to stop there. I needed more than just his words to Sarah. So, I started recording his conversations with mutual friends. It was almost laughable how often he'd throw in casual, underhanded remarks like, "Eric's been acting out of character lately," or, "I just think Sarah deserves someone who's truly supportive." Those little jabs, those seemingly concerned comments, were pathetic. But they were perfect for my growing collection. Each recording captured his feigned innocence, his attempts to plant seeds of doubt, and each one solidified my case. No longer was I his silent shadow. Now, I was the one documenting every word he so carelessly let slip. And then I had a realization. A moment where the idea crystallized. If Jake loved his golden status so much, why not show him what it felt like when that shine began to tarnish? My family and his friends had always seen him as untouchable, the model son and perfect friend. He'd spent his whole life building that image, feeding them stories about his endless virtues and flawless character. But I figured it's easy to be golden when nobody sees what's beneath the surface, when all the rust and rot remain hidden. My plan was simple: pull back the curtain. Let Jake experience firsthand what happens when the people who once believed in him start questioning his intentions. I wasn't about to fabricate anything or create some elaborate lie. I didn't need to. All I had to do was let his own words, the concerned messages to Sarah, the offhand remarks to friends, the warnings about me, come back to haunt him. I wanted him to understand what it felt like when trust turned to suspicion, when the noose he'd tied for me started to tighten around his own neck. And this time, there'd be no pedestal for him to stand on, no way to charm his way out of the web he'd spun. In my search for leverage, I stumbled upon something valuable. Jake's entire career wasn't as solid as he wanted everyone to believe. His so-called success was less about skill and more about playing people. Carefully chosen connections, strings he pulled at the right moments, and underhanded moves that allowed him to leap ahead. My golden brother wasn't some business prodigy. He was a master at gaming the system, using charm and subtle backstabs to climb over anyone who might stand in his way. The same tactics he tried to use on me. Fueled by this revelation, I knew exactly what my next move had to be. It was time for Jake to experience what it felt like when the ground beneath him began to shake. I had my own network, people who were connected to his work circles. So, I started organizing a few casual meetups with those in his professional sphere. Over coffee, I'd slip in some remarks, carefully crafted to sound like genuine concern. "You know, Jake's a sharp guy, but sometimes I wonder if his focus is more on networking than real results," I'd say thoughtfully. Or, "He's certainly personable, but have you ever noticed his approach can seem a bit less than ethical at times?" Each conversation was like planting a small seed, allowing doubt to grow. And once those doubts made their way up the management chain, it wasn't long before Jake's reputation began to shift. His colleagues, those who'd once believed in him, admired him, started to look at him differently. They no longer saw him as the team player he claimed to be. They saw him for what he was, someone who put ambition over integrity. And as I'd hoped, Jake began to feel the tension. The smooth-talking, ever-confident brother of mine started panicking as he noticed his influence slipping, his reputation deteriorating. Then came the day he'd dreaded. His position, one he'd fought tooth and nail to hold on to, one he'd sacrificed friends and morals to achieve, was taken from him. He found out in the most crushing way, blindsided by management's decision to reassess his fit within the organization. Watching his world begin to crumble, piece by piece, was nothing short of a triumph. This was my first victory in dismantling the carefully constructed image he'd spent years building. For once, Jake would know what it was like to lose the pedestal he'd always stood on. And for me, it was only the beginning. Jake had always taken pride in his friendships, as if they were his personal fan club, there to keep up his golden image. Well, it was time to play with that club a bit. I started spreading rumors that my dear brother was a traitor and a liar. Armed, of course, with evidence. I took his words, twisted them out of context so they'd seem as slimy as possible, and let them circulate. All it took were the right emphases and slight edits, and suddenly each of his friends was starting to wonder, whose side is he really on? You know, Jake once said, I'd start in my conversations with his friends, planting seeds of doubt, hinting that Jake was only using people to climb the ladder. And to my surprise, the rumors spread faster than I expected. One by one, his friends started turning away from him. And what do you think happened? At first, Jake didn't understand what was going on. He began feeling surrounded by silence and suspicion. He called friends, sent messages, trying to figure out what was happening. But each time he encountered this wary silence, somewhere nearby his own words would resurface, dressed up in sarcasm and hints that he was a two-faced user. Almost overnight, he was fully isolated. Once adored, he became someone to avoid. His golden image fell apart like a house of cards. In the end, Jake was left with nothing. No job, no friends, a king without his crown, or rather, without his illusion of grandeur. Everything he'd built crumbled before his eyes. And then he finally realized it was me, his little brother, who had turned everything against him. He tried to explain himself, talking about coincidences and misunderstandings, but no one cared anymore. To everyone around him, he was now someone best avoided. Ironic, isn't it? The master of intrigues had become their victim. Jake wasn't ready to admit defeat. He tried to sway Sarah, to win her trust back. And you know what's funny? With the same self-assuredness, he tried telling her, Eric set all this up. It wasn't me. But Sarah knew the whole truth. She'd seen the messages where Jake tried to manipulate her. Saying she was shocked doesn't even cover it. From that moment, Jake was dead to her. And that was probably the final blow for him. And me? I finally found peace. Now Jake sat in the emptiness he'd created for himself.